Hello, I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Alex Holland, the Senior Technology Analyst at IDTechEx. Alex, why renewable diesels? Surely the world is moving towards electric vehicles for all modes of transport, so why invest in alternatives to diesel such as renewable diesel?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. For transport, electrification should probably be the first port of call across various modes of transport. It's the most efficient route to using renewable power effectively, and therefore kind of in general the most environmental route to using renewable power. But I think it's important to maybe have a little bit of context. We ourselves are forecasting somewhere between kind of 20-30% EV adoption sales by the end of the decade, and you can see kind of from those numbers alone that you're going to have a reasonable amount, a reasonable percentage of your fleet still being reliant on the internal combustion engine to some extent. And the fact that you've got increasingly stringent emissions regulations in places like Europe and the US, especially in places like California, but also in countries kind of in Southeast Asia and Brazil and China and so forth. It's important to try and reduce emissions, across the board. And beyond that, obviously, when people talk about electrification, often your mind goes straight towards cars, but there are, of course, different modes of transport that are going to be slightly more difficult to electrify. Although long-term on-road transport in general, should move towards electrification, especially with the battery technology developments we're seeing and some of that build out of infrastructure. But things like heavy duty trucks and freight and so forth, they're going to take slightly longer to electrify. And so renewable diesel, for example, could be a great option for reducing those emissions. And on this slide, of course, I've put kind of that sustainable aviation fuel. I think that's an obvious sector where battery power almost certainly isn't going to be sufficient for aviation, certainly not for long haul flights or even kind of medium range commercial flights.
Interesting, thank you. And the word sustainable is often loosely used. What is the real sustainability of biofuels?
Yeah, so I mean, I've put kind of sustainable aviation fuel here. They don't have to come from biofuels, although for all intents and purposes at the moment they would consist of biofuels. Actually, there are a number of processes to get to sustainable aviation fuel, but the majority of it is done in a similar way in which you make renewable diesel, actually. And obviously, as you mentioned, there are a bunch of questions around the sustainability of biofuels. The impact on land use, the impact on food production, and if you're trying to create an economy or energy consumption from biofuels, there is an impact to that has to be taken into account. And this is where something like electrofuels come in, which don't need the use of that arable land, and it doesn't require any competition with food production.
And so, what are electrofuels or these e-fuels? And again, will they be competing with biofuels and EVs? How does that all shake out?
Yeah, so electrofuels, very basically, are kind of gaseous or liquid fuels that are produced from electricity, ultimately produced from the electrolysis of water. So you're splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you're combining that hydrogen with a source of carbon. Ideally, this comes from carbon capture. This can be from a point source, from direct air capture, for example. And then, various processes in which you can combine the hydrogen and the carbon into an e-fuel. And these can be drop-in fuels, such as sustainable aviation fuel, but it can also be other things, methanol, for example, and that can go into chemicals. So it doesn't always have to go into fuels. And as you mentioned, it will very much be competing with biofuels, less so for electrification, for the reasons I mentioned before. For biofuels, it will take a bit longer for electrofuels to really make it onto the market. And by that point, you'd hope kind of electrification has really taken off by a significant amount.
Okay, and what's holding back electrofuels?
Yeah, so ultimately, it's about cost and efficiency. So if you compare the production of electrofuels to direct electrification of transport or some other sector, for example, any other sector, you're going to have to go through more steps, more processes to get to that final fuel, and that means more energy consumption ultimately. And then at the end of it as well, you've got the use of a combustion engine, maybe a fuel cell, and again, that's going to be less efficient than simply directly using that electrical energy directly in a battery. And so what that means ultimately is cost becomes key, because, as I mentioned, kind of, the electrolysis of water and electrolyzers are a key component of e-fuels, and to get that to be cost effective, ultimately you're going to need very cheap and very abundant electricity. But electrolyzers today, A, are relatively expensive, and B, they're not generally particularly well suited to operating dynamically in a way that would be necessary if they were going to follow the production pattern of a solar PV site or a wind energy site. So there has to be some more development into electrolyzer technology to make sure it's suitable to be able to kind of help with that integration of renewable energy, which is often cited as a benefit of things like hydrogen production, but it applies to e-fuels as well. But that's not necessarily true at the moment, and there are difficulties with doing that. And even further than that, if you are using an electrolyzer that's got this high capital cost, you want your utilization factor to be very high. You want to be able to run it almost constantly. But as I'm sure you can imagine, if you've got a variable source of power such as wind and solar, that's probably not going to be possible, and that's going to make the economics quite difficult.
Very interesting. Thank you, Alex. So you've recently released this new report, Sustainable Alternative Fuels, available from the IDTechEx website. And just tell me a bit more about it briefly. So this covers that whole landscape that you've just briefly touched on. Is that right?
Yeah, so looking, giving an introduction to biofuels, but then a bit more of a focus on kind of growth areas such as renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel, and some of the more slightly advanced kind of biofuels, which maybe are gaining a bit more interest again more recently. And then a section on electric fuels, including kind of ammonia, which you can kind of count within that segment, looking at where the activity is happening, what technologies are being developed and are going to be needed, to make this a success in the long run.
Alex, thank you very much. And so for more information, take a look at the website idtechx.com/altfuel. Thank you.
Cheers, Raghu.